Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. This is episode 97. The title of it is Finally Good News. A little bit of a question mark there to imply that we're not exactly sure what the answer is. It is the week of September 3rd, 2027. And before we jump into the title and the content of this episode, I do have to acknowledge that this is a big week here in Israel. It is school week, back to school week. As I've mentioned before on this podcast, in Israel, school starts on September 1st. I remember as a kid every year having to check the calendar, which day school began. Usually it was after Labor Day, and then they went to before Labor Day. And depending on where you live in the US, maybe other countries, school starts on a different day. Not in Israel. Israel is one big school district. Always on September 1st is the start of school. And yet, here's a trivia question. Why does school almost never start on September 1st in Israel? Doesn't that contradict what I just said, that school always starts on September 1st? And the answer is usually there is a teacher's strike at the beginning of the school year. Since we've lived in Israel now about 9 years, I can't remember one year when school actually began on time. Usually the teachers see it as an opportunity to go on strike for better benefits, for smaller classrooms, for better relationships with parents. One of the big issues here in Israel in the school system is that parents aren't so respectful of teachers. And I got to say, I think this is the trend elsewhere as well. I've talked to friends of mine who are teachers in the US, and when I was a kid, whatever the teacher said, that was the rule of law. And my parents would get mad at me when my teacher would call home and tell them about how I'd been misbehaving in class. I don't think they ever would have thought of standing up for me or talking back to the teacher. But times have changed, and I think everywhere in the world, certainly in our Western world countries that I'm thinking of, teachers don't quite get the respect they used to, but in Israel, all the more so. Parents are very outspoken in terms of standing up for their kids, believing their kids can do no wrong, even if that means putting down the teachers and administration. So that's one of the things that teachers tend to strike for. However, one of the pieces of good news is that so far there isn't a strike here in Israel this week. So it does look like school will be starting up on time. And that's a good thing for everyone, because if there's one thing this country needs, it's normalcy. We live in a country where, well, look how our summer vacation began. Summer break, what they call in Israel, Chofesh Hagadol, the big vacation, as opposed to Hanukkah break or Passover break. This is Chofesh Hagadol, the big break. It didn't really have an official beginning this year. School was postponed, like we had a few days that were canceled because of the war with Iran, and then graduations were postponed. And then before you know it, we just sort of, it petered out and we sort of tiptoed into summer vacation without really realizing it. So we need normalcy. We need our kids to go back to school. And I personally only have one more kid at this point who is going to school. My oldest three have all graduated out of the school system. I have one who's beginning high school tomorrow, which is 10th grade here in Israel. I was trying to tell him what my first day of 10th grade was like, and I completely blanked. I don't have a single memory, which just goes to show you that all the things that he and his friends are anxious about won't matter a damn 30 years down the road. But in any case, it's a big week here in Israel with school beginning, always on September 1st. And now on to the main part of this episode. As I said, the title is Finally Good News. And so often on this podcast, I feel like I'm bringing bad news to you. Believe it or not, I'm a comedian in real life, and I go around making people laugh and trying to bring joy to people. But when I put on my podcast host hat, it's often very serious, and a lot of the times because we're talking about what's happening in Israel. It's not always great news. It's a very dour pot of subject matter. Since I've begun meeting with you just about 2 years ago, we've talked about, I made a little list here, judicial reform and government unrest. Of course, the hostage crisis. We are coming up upon 700 days since October 7th. At the end of this week will be the 700th day, I believe Thursday or Friday of this week. And that means we've had hostages in Gaza for 700 days. I've talked about Israeli society coming apart at the seams and how our biggest enemy, the biggest threat to Israel, is not Iran or Hamas or Hezbollah, but ourselves and the internal divisions we are struggling with as we try to figure out just what it means to be a Jewish country or a country for Jews. Those are not the same thing. And that question, that paradigm is really at the heart of all the struggles internally here in Israel. But this week, for the first time, maybe one of the first times in the past 2 years, I really do feel I can bring you some good news, and it relates to a couple of trips I recently took. Some of you may know, I think I mentioned this in my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, that Dorit and I went to Cyprus. Wow, it feels like forever ago, but it was just about 2 weeks ago. We spent 5 days in Cyprus. One of our kids was away at a camp. The other three are all old enough and are happy to have us gone. So we went one of our first vacations since living here, maybe our only one that the two of us went on. And since mentioning that in the newsletter, a lot of you wrote in with related questions. For example, Stu wrote in, did you experience anti-Israel sentiment on your trip to Cyprus? Ruthie wrote, did you feel safe being Jewish on your trip to Cyprus? And there were about a dozen other questions along that vein. And just some other context is last weekend I went to Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was shorter than my trip to Cyprus, believe it or not. I flew to Atlanta, drove to Chattanooga, slept the night, did a show the next morning, flew back to New York, back to Atlanta, and drove back to Atlanta, and then flew back to the U.S., all within a span of 4.5 days. Flew back to Israel. It was one of the quickest trips I've ever taken, but I did have a chance to soak up the ambience in the United States for those 4 or 5 days. And that's the background, those two trips, Cyprus and the U.S. And here's my response in a few parts. So first of all, in Cyprus, we felt completely safe, and I mean 100%. And we experienced zero anti-Israel sentiment. We didn't see any of it anywhere. And that's a good thing. But beyond that, there's something else. And what I'm going to do right now is politically incorrect. This isn't the type of thing you're really allowed to say, but in this podcast, truth, full truth, even if it's kind of not pretty truth. Many times during our trip to Cyprus, what do I mean by many? 4, 5, 6 times, but it felt like a lot. When people found out we were from Israel, they leaned in closer and confided to us that they support us and that they are really frightened about the growing Arab population in their own country. And I'm not just talking about strangers we met on the street. I'm talking about the woman behind the desk at our hotel, the maitre d' at our restaurant, a waiter at a different restaurant, people who are running businesses. And the last thing you want to do when you run a business is start getting all racial and bigoted and putting down various ethnic groups who are in your country. But it was really notable to me and remarkable that a few times when people found out we were from Israel, they shook their heads and said what a shame it was, what we were going through, and that they can relate to what we're going through, and are they themselves disturbed by the growing Arab populations in their own country. And we saw that, a few times. We saw, I don't want to say a gang, but what would you call it if there were a dozen or 20 Arab young men walking on the beach, making a lot of noise and kind of shouting, and they notice that too, the locals, and it makes them wonder what's happening to their country. And believe it or not, it actually leads to sympathy with Israel. And please don't come away from this thinking that I am saying that all Arabs are bad, because they're certainly not. And Dorit and I have friends who are Arab here in Israel. But I'm talking about sort of a meta feeling that we experienced and were able to tap into while we were in Cyprus. And that goes for Greece as well. You know, earlier on in this summer, I guess a little tangent here. Earlier on in the summer, we went to Greece as a family. And there we actually saw a lot of anti-Israel sentiment, posters that said, you know, IDF baby killers and Israel soldier die. And, you know, they weren't necessarily grammatically correct messages, but that these were the messages on the posters. And a lot of them had bloody, you know, red handprints on them. But the sense we got from talking with locals in Greece is that this is mostly the Arab population in Greece who is responsible for these posters and messaging, as well as really, really far left, what you might call progressive, woke segments of the population in Greece. But by and large, it does not represent the Greek sentiment toward Israel overall. And, you know, in fact, about 3 weeks ago, there was supposed to be this day of rage in Greece against Israel. And this came on the heels of a couple of cruise ships with Israelis not being allowed to dock in Greece because of all the protesters and threatened violence. And so now there was going to be this big day of rage where they expected thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Greeks to come out and protest and show their hatred toward Israel. And long story short, nothing happened. You know, there were a few protests scattered throughout the country, maybe with you know, under 100 people each, but nothing happened. So this idea that people in these countries are just waiting for Israelis to show up so they can pounce on us and and do violent things to us or admonish us. It just wasn't the sense I got. I felt extremely safe and welcomed really with open arms, and and have nothing but good things to say on a personal level about our trip to Cyprus and even to Greece. Like I said, we saw some of that anti-Israel messaging, but on a personal level, absolutely none of it. Now, as for last weekend in the U.S., aside from my show at the Jewish Federation, where you obviously we talked about Israel a lot, you know, I didn't have a ton of interaction with people during my 5 days there, but enough to realize that for most people, for the average American, Israel is not on their mind at all. You know, watching the news here in Israel or, uh, you know, reading the media, the websites, you just get the sense that the entire world is boiling over with rage at Israel. You see these protests on college campuses and encampments filled with students and people who aren't students. And you just get the sense that everyone is talking about us all the time and that the number one topic of conversation is how evil and bad Israel is. But when I was in the US, it just became so obvious that most people, it's out of sight, out of mind. If you were to ask them, who are you more frightened of, Israel or Hamas? I am sure that most Americans would say Hamas is by far the scarier one. I can understand completely why many Americans would be troubled by what they're seeing in Gaza. I don't think they have that deep, nuanced understanding to really get into the nitty gritty of why we're bombing hospitals and the fact that bombing hospitals is actually legal according to the rules of war. If the enemy is using the hospital as a base of operations, it is legal to bomb a hospital. It has to do with risk versus payoff, and there's very intricate rules. And most people don't have the brain space for that. And so I can understand why they're troubled by what they see happening in Gaza. And, you know, whether you like it or not, people are hungry in Gaza. Is it famine? I don't know. Is it starvation? I don't know. But are people hungry? Yes, for sure. And that's not pleasant to see. But people are not walking around thinking about Israel 24/7. They are thinking about their own lives. They are thinking about the slew of domestic problems that are boiling and arising right now in the US, affecting everyone across the political spectrum. There's economic issues people are worried about. And plus, they're concerned with how their sports teams are doing and the latest reels on Instagram and TikTok and, the hypnosis of social media that they're sucked into. And if anything, that's why there are feelings about Israel at all, is that we live in this age where social media is so, so powerful. I mean, I just see it. I see how many people are staring into their phones all the time. And so if Israel isn't putting a message there, then we're not reaching people. That's the bottom line. But I really did come away from all of these trips feeling part of me says I don't want to use the word overblown, that our worries about anti-Israel sentiment are overblown. But in a way, that is kind of what I feel, that it's not nearly as big a deal as we may think it is. I think we hear about the outliers, we hear from the ones who make the most noise. But my takeaway is that it's really trendy to be anti-Israel right now. The same way veganism is trendy and it sort of says something about you if you're a vegan, or if you care for the environment in a certain way. I think it's trendy to be anti-Israel right now. It shows that you stand up for the underdog. It shows that you care about human rights. But I really don't think that the common person is going around with violent anti-Israel sentiments. That most people are simply worried about their own lives and maybe even concerned about the Muslim populations in their own countries more than they are about Israel and what Israel is doing. So what does this mean for us? Does this mean that we need to stop worrying about PR, that we need to stop worrying about messaging? I think for me, if there's any takeaway, it's that to the extent that we do have messaging, and we really don't, but to the extent that we do, or that we might want to begin doing some, we really don't want to go in the direction of facts. I think that's the big mistake that Israel and pro-Israel people have always made. We've thought if we can just get the facts on the table and explain about how Jews lived here 3,000 years ago and the destruction of two temples and the Balfour Declaration and the White Paper and the UN declaration in 1947 and the War of Independence. Like, we feel like if we can just explain the facts on social media, people will suddenly take our side or see the light. But I think we've we've been missing is that social media is not the place for facts. It's a place for emotion. And the Palestinian cause, the Hamas cause, they have done an amazing job tapping into people's emotion. Whereas those trying to message for Israel have relied almost entirely on facts and on gotcha situations where we try to make the other side look wrong or stupid, which I think just backfires and makes us look bad. So we do need messaging, but we need messaging that fits the medium. And the mediums that worked in the past don't exist anymore. The long newspaper article where you really delve into the facts and parse the story doesn't exist. Even the New York Times writes in single paragraphs to get people's attention and uses video. So whoever's going to bat for Israel, whether it's officially the Israeli government, which they are not, I don't think they even have a department of diplomacy at this point. But those around the world, the influencers who are trying to make a difference, we really have to start going in the direction of emotion and not in facts, because people just swipe when they start seeing boring old facts on their phone screens. We're going to come back in about 20 seconds. I'm going to take a quick break. This is Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff from Ra'anana. Welcome back to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff, again, coming to you from Ra'anana in Israel this week. And we have two questions sort of off topic, but I really like them. The first one is from Jay. Jay writes in, I love the song A New Day Will Rise by Yuval Raphael, which, as you undoubtedly know, placed second in the 2025 Eurovision contest. Jay writes that he did a little research on her and learned that Yuval comes from Ra'anana, which is my hometown. I also read that she was at the Nova Music Festival on October 7th and sustained injuries. Is this information consistent with what you know? Does your family have any connection with her or her family? Any possibility of having her as a guest on Inside Israel? Well, I'll address that last one first. Sure, I would love to have her as a guest. I have not looked into it so far, but you are correct, Jay. She is from Ra'anana. And you're also correct that she was at the Nova Festival on October 7th and did sustain injuries there. And she placed in second, but to get a little corny in the hearts of Israelis, she was number one. It meant so much to us to have one of our own up there on the stage placing second. And this is not the first time a Ra'anana gal has gone to Eurovision in recent years. I do believe, is it Noah Kirel, who is also from Ra'anana? There's something about Ra'anana. We have an excellent music school, so that could be it. But we tend to produce really good singers and really good musicians. There, so I think this was Yuval Raphael the other day. There was a big traffic jam in Tel Aviv, either because of protests or because of construction. There's always one or the other going on. And, people were honking their horns and angry. And I believe it was Yuval Raphael who got out of her car. She was in the traffic jam too and began singing in the middle of the highway. And people didn't really know what was going on at first, but a few people recognized her and then came out of their cars and started, she did a little show right there on the highway. And that's one of those only in Israel moments that you really won't get anywhere else. But kudos to her for doing that. And yeah, she is a Ra'ananin, one of us. I'd love to have her as a guest at some point. I'll look into it. Lynn writes, Shalom Yoel. I love it when people call me by the Hebrew name. I recently attended a program by the Israeli Scouts here in the U.S. They're called the Tzofim. On their shirts was the motto of the Tzofim, Haya Nachon. It apparently translates as be prepared, which is the same as the U.S. Scout motto. However, I thought Nachon means to be correct or to be right. Can you shed any light on this, please? So, cool question. I had never heard of the Tzofim having a slogan. I'm a big fan of the Tzofim. They came to my JCC and my summer camps when I was a kid growing up, Young Judea and Ramah, and they sang their songs, Yeshasho Alim Elenu, and still embedded in my brain. I did not know they had a slogan, but I looked it up. Yeah, their slogan is Haya Nachon, which means be prepared. And you're right. I always thought Nachon means correct, to be right or to be correct. So I asked my good friend Gabi Shitrit, who is my linguist that I go to whenever I have questions like this. And Gabi explained that the word muchan, to be ready, and the word nachon, to be correct, actually come from the same shoresh, or the same root. And you can hear it in the words muchan, meaning to be ready, and nachon, to be correct. They sound very similar. And so what's the interpretation here? I think, Hebrew is full of these hidden messages that can teach us how to live. And I think what Hebrew is telling us is that to be prepared, according to Hebrew, means being prepared to do the right thing. So it's not enough just to prepare. It's to prepare to behave the right way and to act correctly and to hold yourself to a standard. And in the case of the Scouts, this means to help others, to think creatively, to work hard. You're preparing yourself to do the right thing. So in Hebrew, the idea is that readiness and correctness are connected. So in Hebrew, there really is no such thing as preparing yourself to commit a crime, because preparation inherently assumes that you are doing good, that you are doing the right thing, doing the correct thing. Linguistically, it's simply not possible to prepare to do something incorrect. So I really love that message here. And Lynn, I thank you for pointing it out. And anyone else who has questions about Hebrew, always send those in. As you know, I'm a big lover of the Hebrew language, and I'm always looking for little hidden messages and life lessons that we can find embedded in Hebrew words. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's broadcast of Inside Israel. Our next live broadcast will be on Sunday, September 7th, 2025 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You can always send questions to me about Hebrew or about anything else. Send those through the website at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Lahitraot, everyone. Here's to a good week for all of us.